Hello, my name's David Buckingham. I'm a British academic, researcher, teacher, educator, teacher, and I'm the author of this book, The Manifesto for Media Education. In the UK, the book looks like this. In Brazil, it looks like this, much more beautiful, I think. I thought it would be useful to tell you a bit about the context of this book and really what motivated me to write it in the first place. I've been teaching about media for my whole career. I've been a media educator. And I think important to say that media education for me means teaching about media. It's not just about teaching with media or through media. It's not about educational technology or educational media. It's about teaching about media and how media work. We have a history of this in the UK. You can look back to the 1930s and you can find examples of people arguing and presenting proposals for teaching about advertising, the cinema, popular literature. And then if we come forward to the 60s and 70s, the focus shifts more to television and then computer games and the internet and so on. Media studies as a subject is a separate subject taught at the top end of secondary schools. Media education is also a dimension of English mother tongue language teaching. And I think important to say that media education is also both a critical and a creative endeavour. So it's about enabling students to make their own media creatively, but also enabling them to critically understand the media and how they work. I wrote the book really because at the moment I think we're rather on the back foot. There's been a lot of talk in the UK and I think internationally about something called media literacy. A lot of that talk comes out of communications policy. And I think the sense is that it's becoming harder and harder to regulate media. So what we need to do is to empower people to regulate their own use of media, to become informed consumers of media. Now, that's all very well, but frankly, I think a lot of it is just talk. There's a lot of hot air. And if we really want to have media literacy as a basic entitlement for the population, we actually need media education. We need there to be sustained, systematic programs of education happening in schools and in other education institutions. There's been a lot, obviously, of emphasis on technology in schools, but my feeling is that a lot of that is quite instrumental. It's about using computers and other digital devices as tools for teaching. But in the process, my argument is if we're going to use those devices, we also need to talk about and teach about how these media represent the world, how these media work as systems of communication. I think more recently we've also become caught up in the rightward drift of education policy. I think this is something that's affecting all humanities, social science subjects. I think in many ways in Britain we're going backwards in our understanding of education and in the curriculum. So my focus in this book was partly to make the case again, to make the argument again, but also to look to the future, to think about the digital media, social media that now surround us. How can we take those approaches from the past and apply them to these new and emerging media? How do we have to extend media education? How do we develop it? How do we perhaps need to rethink it to take account of changing realities? So, why should we teach about media and teach about social media? In a way, the answer is a pretty obvious one. These media are part of everyday life. They're a fact of life. They're everywhere around us. And so if we want to enable children, young people, to understand the world, to become active participants in the world, then we really need to enable them to understand media. Just a couple of statistics I came across in the last week or so. Apparently, in the UK anyway, research shows that teenagers are spending as much as 7 hours a day on their phones. That's an average figure. 1 in 5 3- and 4-year-olds have their own mobile phone, their own mobile device. 75% of 3- and 4-year-olds are accessing media on phones from parents and so on. So what we're talking about is something that is all around us. We're talking about something that is really central to our political system, to political debate, central to the economy, the operations of the economy, central to culture. We're talking about things that are really part of the cultural communicative environment. And what we're addressing as media educators is really what is going on in children's experience outside school. How do we enable school to prepare them for this new digital media saturated world? So in a sense, that's the obvious answer. We need to be doing this because it's out there, it's a fact of life. But I think there are other aspects, and in particular, what is quite evident is that these media are controlled, increasingly owned by big global corporations. The market is dominated by what some people call the FANGs: Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, and so on. These big companies, the biggest companies in the world, owned by some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. And the question is, how do we respond to this situation? Typically, the argument is that we need to regulate these media. There are potential dangers here, and we need to have government intervening to limit the power of global corporations. I think there's a lot to be said for that, but I think one of the things that governments around the world are increasingly finding is that sort of regulation, that kind of intervention in the market, either they're reluctant to do it in the first place, or even if they want to do it, it's exceptionally difficult to do. The technology is moving too fast. Actually, it's very difficult to know where and how you intervene. So I would say, yes, we do need regulation. We need regulation that will limit some of the potential dangers that are at stake here, but we also need education. So we need to be preparing children with a set of critical understandings about how these media work. That's a very old argument. It's an argument people have been making about older media. I think it applies absolutely to new media and to social media as well. One of the questions I am often asked by journalists, and have been asked really through my career, is, well, are these media, are these new developments, this new program, this new piece of software, are these things good or bad for children? And I think there's often an assumption that we can balance out the good and bad. We can maximize the benefits of these things while minimizing the harm. It seems to me there is a problem here, really, with this kind of either or balancing out way of thinking. If we look historically, we can see there's been a real shift in how we think about media, and it actually happens with every medium. It happened actually with the medium of the novel. It happened with the cinema. It happened with television. And now over the last kind of 15, 20 years, we've seen it with digital media as well. So you can look back to the beginning of the century, really, and you can see a kind of cyber utopianism, as I tend to call it. A lot of the key players in the early technology industry were driven by principles from the counterculture. The idea was that digital media, the internet, was going to be a force of liberation and empowerment for ordinary individuals, a kind of power for the people. New communities would be created, new forms of dialogue, new forms of learning and creativity, and so on. I think in the last 10 years, certainly the last 5 years, the debate has been dominated almost by the polar opposite position. There was always concern about pornography and paedophiles and other dangers lurking online. But in recent years, we've seen a broader set of concerns, partly about democracy, political concerns about so-called fake news, disinformation, hate speech, surveillance, the gathering of data, of people's data. So it's partly political, but it's also on a more individual psychological level. It's about well-being. It's about the danger that as we spend more and more time with social media, we become narcissistic, we become depressed, we're addicted. There are all sorts of dangers for our mental health. Now, my feeling is that the problem with this is that both of these sets of concerns tend to be overstated. There's always this argument either that technology will take us to utopia or technology will take us all to hell. And as I've said, you can see very, very similar kind of arguments made in the 1950s and 1960s around the advent of television. Television was going to be the greatest guarantee of democracy, for example. And then really quite quickly, people start saying the very opposite. The problem, I think, is that, you know, in reality, if you look at people's experience, if you look at children's experience, what we find is that the good and bad are interconnected. You can't separate out the good from the bad and have one and not the other. I think also our temptation is always, when we talk about young people, to want to protect, to want to intervene, which is natural. But the danger is that it can become very paternalistic, particularly if it's not very well informed. My argument is rather than protection, what we really need is preparation. What we need to do is to enable children to cope, to deal with the digital, the media world that they're coming into. I think one of the dangers, if we obsess about the harm, for example, what we're often doing is looking at the symptoms of what are actually much bigger problems. We need to look at the causes rather than simply trying to treat the symptoms. And what that means is there are going to be no quick fixes. There is no magic technological or other solution that's really going to solve the problem. We need something much more sustained and systematic and educationally focused. There's been a lot of talk about media literacy, increasingly internationally, I think. Media regulators are becoming very interested in the idea of empowering people to be informed consumers of media. In the UK, for more than 20, almost 20 years, we've had a media regulator, Ofcom, which has been very concerned to push ahead this idea of media literacy, a kind of citizen empowerment, if you like. I'm afraid my feeling about this is that it's often rather limited. It's often a lot of people talking about good intentions, but without actually doing anything very much. And I feel very much that if we're going to have a media literate population, then we need media education. Now, in the UK, we have a set of concepts that really inform our teaching about media, that inform media education. And I think they're critical concepts that still are very applicable to new media, to digital and social media. So there are 4 key concepts, just very quickly. Media language. How do media create meaning? And I think what that means is, if we're looking at social media, what we need to acknowledge is that this is not just an open, expressive space. There are rules and conventions that apply to language, the language of social media, the language of TikTok or whatever it may be. Second question, representation. How do media represent reality? And again, I think this is not just simply about information. I think there are actually some very complicated questions about reliability, credibility, trust that would come under this general set of issues. Thirdly, production. So we're asking questions about who makes these media, how they make them, and why. And what that means is looking particularly at the economics of all of this. These media, although they seem to us to be free, they're not free. Actually, they operate on the gathering of data, which is then sold to advertisers. These are new data-based business models that are operating in this market. And finally, audience. Who is using these media, how and why? And again, I would want to say this is not simply about media empowering people. There are new forms of creativity emerging, but also new forms of surveillance and control. Now, I think those 4 concepts are still a very useful framework for thinking about social media. If we think, for example, about the whole debate that's gone on about fake news and disinformation, I think we can see pretty clearly that there is a danger if we think of this in very simplistic terms as a matter of truth versus falsehood. Actually, a lot of the explanation for the circulation of so-called fake news is down to the operation of media industries. It's down to the fact that fake news is profitable. And in some ways, there is a danger if we assume that we can solve the problem with an easy, quick fix. We can just check the facts and we can rely on the facts. The reality is that actually there's always going to be room for debate. And really what we need is people to be thinking much more critically about the range of things that they're using. There's not going to be a simple one-size-fits-all distinction. So I think what I would say here is that what we have in media education is a broad framework that encompasses a range of different media phenomena. It is, I would want to emphasize, not just about protecting children from harm. Media education is not just about teaching internet safety. It's something much broader and more generally applicable to a much wider range of media phenomena. Last of all, I wanted to talk about a couple of questions that arise about the relation between adults, teachers, parents, and young people in all of this. In general terms, I would say there is a real tendency when we talk about young people and media, there is a tendency for adults to underestimate what children already know. We tend to assume that children are vulnerable, innocent, easily manipulated. But I think certainly I have found as a researcher and as a parent, when you start to talk to children about what is going on, what you find is that actually they have often got quite a developed, sophisticated, critical understanding of what's going on in their own use of media. Having said that, we need to avoid the other extreme. I think there is a danger that we romanticize children in all of this. We we assume that somehow children are naturally wise and knowledgeable and they know everything. This idea of the digital native, that us older people are digital immigrants, we really don't understand. Kids just know everything naturally because they've grown up with it, they're digital natives. And again, I think this is a very romanticized, simplistic view. I think what we need to know more about as educators, as parents, but also as researchers, is really, what do children know and what do children not know? What is it that children don't know? And I think there are some elements of the bigger context which children don't necessarily understand. So they may understand very well the etiquette of communication online in a message group or in making a TikTok video, but what do they really understand about, for example, the companies who own these means of communication? What do they understand about how data is being gathered about them and how that data is being used, and so on? So I think there are some things that children do know, and we need to give them credit for that. But actually, there are also some things that children don't know, and we really need to identify what those things are. Another aspect that often kind of comes into this is the whole question of screen time. What do we do? What should we be doing as parents to control and, for most people, to limit the amount of time that young people are spending online? And for me, this is not really a very useful discussion. A global figure of screen time is not very useful. What we need to be thinking about is, when children go online, what are they doing? There are many things, different things they may be doing. When are they doing it? Why are they doing it? Who are they doing it with? And I think once we ask those kinds of questions, we discover that screen time is not a single thing that is either good or bad, and there's some magic number that if I said, it should be half an hour a day or an hour and a half a day, that somehow we would have solved the problem. It depends on what children are doing and why. And all that points to the fact that we need, as adults, to be initiating a shared dialogue with children about what is going on. We do actually need not to pry on them, but we need to actually engage with them and discuss with them what they're doing. And in that, we need to be very careful to avoid being patronizing. We need to avoid the sense that, we know everything and they know nothing, or vice versa. They know everything and we know nothing. We actually need a dialogue. There are things that we understand that they don't, and vice versa. And I think what that leads to is a sense that actually, if all we're doing as adults, as parents, is being the police, if all we're doing is laying down rules and saying, you must do this, you mustn't do that, you must do this for a fixed amount of time or not do it at certain times, actually, I think we know that that is not a very effective form of parenting. We need to have a dialogue rather than a set of fixed rules.